Welcome back to the Modern Maze, everybody. I hope that you are all doing well. Thank you so much for all of your support these past few weeks. It's been an incredible time for me just to witness this project of mine that I've been working on for so long finally being put out there into the universe and being met with such love and appreciation and feedback. And it means the absolute world to me. So thank you to everyone who's listened and recommended and engaged with me. It's been, I have no words. So shout out to everybody listening, and there's much more to come. Just a few housekeeping things before we jump into today's episode. It would mean the world to me if you could continue sharing this podcast and following on Instagram, recommending it to people. I haven't been too into the marketing phase of this journey yet. So from what I understand, it seems to be that word of mouth is a really good tool to use. And so I would just ask you, if you find this podcast interesting and you enjoy the discussions here, then please feel free to recommend it. It would mean the world to me again. But you just being here is plenty enough. That's just a little sprinkling on top of the ice cream. I don't know if people still get that. You know, you get your little sprinkles on your ice cream. Anyways, moving on. There are many exciting things going on right now. I'm going to speak to them on my Instagram. I want to start creating some articles as well, because I'm reading things and I'm thinking about these topics that we're covering, and it's almost like little appendix pieces that I want to add onto our discussion, and I really want to try and write about it and perhaps use that as a way to engage with a broader audience as well. And so that's something that I'm going to be looking to launch in the next few weeks. I found an article specifically about the concepts, one of the concepts in donut economics that I think would be really interesting. So expect that sometime in the near future. But today's episode is all about the birth of capitalism. So where did it begin? How did it begin? And I really came across the history of capitalism when I started reading a book called Less is More by Dr. Jason Hickel. He is an economic anthropologist, an author, and a professor. His research is sort of mainly focused on the global political economy, inequality, and ecological economics. This book, Less is More, it speaks to this concept of degrowth. Now, degrowth calls for the abolishment of economic growth as a social objective and signifies another direction where societies actually use less natural resources and therefore have to organize themselves very differently than how we are organized today. So whereas donut economics was challenging the concepts of growing endlessly and how do we organize ourselves around that, I think that was more talking about the economic theories and stories and pictures that are so prevalent in today's society, and how do we change that narrative. Degrowth is a little bit different, where it's a broader term and it speaks to using less resources. So actually scaling back, not consuming more and more. So this book interested me. I bought it expecting a more solution-based book, which it definitely has. But it begins with a lot of interesting concepts about the beginnings of capitalism. Now, I'm going to ask to take a moment to reflect together. When I pose the question, how do you think capitalism began? Or what's the story in your mind about how capitalism began? what comes to your mind? Let's have a little reflection. Take some time, maybe a deep breath. Close your eyes if you can. Not if you're driving, don't do that. And let's take a moment and think about it. What is the origins of capitalism? Okay. Well, I'm sure that there are a huge range of answers. And I think capitalism, the word and the concept really does that. For me at least, it invokes really strong feelings. And I wasn't entirely sure about what I felt. I think conflicted was the word. When I used to think about the history of capitalism, I never consciously gave it much thought about where it began. I kind of told this story to myself that it was a natural process and it's just a part of human evolution and a part of who we are, and it's an inevitable path that we've taken. When I read this book, I was pretty surprised. I was quite alarmed by how much more brutal and unfair it was than I could have ever imagined. And we really do tend to think of capitalism as an inevitable part of the human story, right? It's always been around. And that there was a smooth transition to it from markets and bazaars. It is not like that at all. It is honestly a lot darker, bloodier, and quite surprising. The truth kind of shocked me, and I think it may shock you as well. Now, while markets have been around for thousands of years, thousands, probably even longer, capitalism is only about 500 years old. And something that I think about often is our recency bias in modern society, thinking that the way that something is, right, is the way that it's always been. So we have recency bias and maybe thinking that capitalism is just the way that life was meant to be and naturally grew into it. And so therefore no significant change is needed. Now, the next few episodes, so there's a few follow-up episodes from this, we're specifically going to be talking about the beginning of capitalism and its rise. Right now, we're not going to be discussing about what capitalism gets wrong, etc. We're going to follow a story here. So we're going to go through its origins, why it happened. We're then going to touch on the underlying principles and philosophies behind it. I think this is going to give all of us a robust understanding about the mechanics of capitalism, and then we can assess it together. I think with things like this, for myself, I'm afraid of just making an overarching judgment without a lot of research. And I do reference books a lot, and I use that as a source of reference to make statements and claims. But wherever we can, I want to try for myself and for my audience and to put this message out there to consciously take in the full story and really look at it from all angles. I believe that without understanding the actual, behind the scenes reasons why capitalism is the way it is, we might lose some of the context and the real meanings of its structures and mechanisms. Who doesn't love an origin story? I think origin stories are really important because they help us look at the root causes of issues and the intentions behind it. We get to see how the story has evolved over time. And this allows us to critically analyze something like capitalism if we look at the underlying principles and the birth of it, rather than just a straight up critique of where it's at now. While that is useful and, we are definitely going to touch on that, much like donut economics, these principles and thought patterns and beliefs and biases are something that are so deeply ingrained in us that I think without truly having an appreciation of why the way things are, we may lose some of the context. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that all references will be included in the show notes. This episode is going to be mostly based on that book that I mentioned, Less is More. I highly recommend, if you're interested, to go out and read this as maybe the next book from Donut Economics, and for those seeking a sustainable and equitable future and how we might get there. So, what exactly is capitalism? Before we begin, I'm going to put out a disclaimer. Capitalism has had some immense benefits on human development, such as increased innovation, increased living standards, increased literacy and education levels. However, not everybody in this system benefits equally, and there are winners and losers. I don't want to give the impression that capitalism has had no good effect on the world, because that's simply not true. Especially as me, somebody who has led a pretty damn privileged life in a developed nation, and I would be remiss if I said that capitalism has just been bad, because it's partly given me the life that I have today. Let's start with a textbook definition of capitalism. So, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as an economic system characterized by the private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. So in a capitalist system, capital goods such as machinery, tools, and buildings that are used to produce goods and services are owned by individuals or companies rather than the government or communities. As well, in capitalism, investment decisions such as what to invest in, how much to invest, and when to invest are made by private individuals or corporations based on their interests and the potential for profit. If we're talking specifically about speculative investing, right, I'm going to put stock in Nvidia because I know, or I'm guessing, that their profit is continuing to increase, and that makes it attractive for me. Competition in a free market, so prices for goods and services in a capitalist economy, these are not set by the government. Now, they can intervene, but the prices are determined by competition amongst businesses in the market. Companies will adjust their production levels and their distribution strategies based on supply and demand and their need to compete against each other. These are just some of the characteristics of capitalism. Now, absolute capitalism exists, but it's only kind of in theory. The reality is that no country has been believed to have achieved a 100% capitalist economy. All capitalist economies are mixed to one degree or another. Let's go through an example. So the United States is actually referred to as a mixed market economy, which means that it blends characteristics of both capitalism and socialism. In the United States, the means of production, such as manufacturers, are privately owned and operated for profit. Now, this is clearly a capitalist approach. But because the economy has regulations, taxation, and some subsidization, the United States is not purely a capitalist society. The government has at least partial control over education, roads, healthcare. It also provides these subsidies to sectors such as oil companies, financial companies, agricultural producers. So government does have a hand to play in this free market. So technically, not a full capitalist society by definition, but what I believe in, something that we're going to explore together, is that the themes of capitalism and the beliefs and the structures are very much the predominant part of most societies, especially most Western societies, I would bet. But that's something that we're going to test. Now, the not so textbook definition, in her book titled Cannibalism, Capitalism, Nancy Fraser, who is an American philosopher and professor of political and social science, describes capitalism as not a type of economy, but to a type of society, one that authorizes an officially designated economy to pile up monetized value for investors and owners, while devouring the non-economized wealth of everyone else. So what Nancy is saying here is that it's not just the economic mechanisms, but it's also the broader societal structure that prioritizes economic gains over other values. So if you think about donut economics, we really touched upon the economic mechanisms that prioritize economic gains. What Nancy's saying here is that it's actually the broader societal structure that prioritizes gains over other values. When she says one that authorizes an officially designated economy to pile up monetized value for investors and owners, she's saying that society basically legitimizes a system which primarily benefits a select group, which is the investors and owners, accumulating wealth for them. Again, tying back to donut economics, in one of the principles, I think it was designed to distribute, we talked about how we need to think about not just who makes the money, but who owns what. And the fact that capital has grown at a faster rate than the economy means that it's the ones who hold the capital, so the investors and the owners, and how they can accumulate wealth at a faster rate than those that don't. And then she points out that while a few accumulate wealth, the broader population loses non-monetary wealth. So this is things like environmental resources, cultural heritage, or community bonds. It started raining again. I swear every time I sit down to do a podcast, it just decides to just start raining in the middle of it. She goes on to say, serving that wealth on a platter to the corporate classes, this society invites them to make a meal of our creative capacities and the earth that sustains us, with no obligation to replenish what they consume or repair what they damage. And that is a recipe for trouble. What Nancy is going on to say here is that there is really a transfer of wealth from the broader society to the corporate elite. And she also criticizes that the economic system exploits human creativity and natural resources for profit. She also points out a lack of accountability from those who benefit from the system are not held responsible for the depletion or destruction they cause. And then she concludes with, and that is a recipe for trouble, ... She's warning us that this model is unsustainable and is going to lead to significant problems, hinting at economic, environmental, and societal crises. Now, I know 10 minutes ago I said that we weren't going to critique this just yet, but I came across this and I thought it was just interesting the way that it's framed and something that we can discuss and dive into. But this is some of the things that we heard about the economy from donut economics. Capitalism is really that political and broader structure that sits around the economy and dictates so much about it. So it's not surprising to hear it described in so many similar ways that the economy is. because what's the relation between capitalism and the economy, right? It's pretty hand in hand. It sets the laws, the beliefs, the structures, right, for the economy to thrive in that particular direction. So something to note, we're going to critique more and analyze more, but I thought it'd be just a good little context as to some of the potential problems of capitalism. And I think it frames up the story, and I think the story is going to illuminate some of these thoughts from Nancy and gives a bit of evidence to these claims. All right, let's begin our story time with Aria. So grab a blankie, grab a hot chocolate or a cacao, and let's get started. Unlike a bedtime story, this story is a little bit grim, so I'm going to spare us the details when needed. I am reading this from Less is More, so I'm just going to be following the narrative that's presented in the book, and we'll take little breaks when needed. So where and when did capitalism come from? It emerged from Western Europe and was born from the ashes of feudalism. Now, there are common narratives that say that capitalism put an end to feudalism. However, this honor really goes to a courageous struggle fought by everyday people. Feudalism was a system in medieval Europe where people lived and worked on large estates called manors, and these manors were owned by nobles or lords. In exchange for protection and a place to live, people known as serfs or peasants would work the land and give a portion of the crop to the lords. The lords, in turn, they owed loyalty and military service to more powerful lords or the king. So this created a strict hierarchy with the king at the top and then followed by nobles, knights, and then peasants all the way at the bottom. Feudalism was not only a social arrangement, but also a way of managing land and political power. And this was important because during this time, governments were not as centralized as they were today. Now, feudalism was a terrible system that produced a mass scale of human misery. Lords and nobles controlled the land and the people who lived on them. These people were forced to pay tributes in the forms of taxes, rent, and unpaid labor. These poor people endured harsh agricultural conditions, economic challenges, and they surrendered much of their produce to lords. Limited rights, famine threats, and heavy taxes imposed on them did not help their situation. Now, in the early 1300s, commoners across Europe began rebelling against the feudal system. They were demanding direct control over the land that they cultivated. But unfortunately, they had little success. In most cases, they were defeated by heavily armed militaries. Things only got worse when the Black Death struck in 1347. But something good and unexpected happened after this disaster. Land suddenly became way more abundant because the population had reduced, and therefore the peasants and workers actually found themselves in a unique position to negotiate better terms. And this was the first time in generations that they had this opportunity. The commoners saw that they have an opportunity to change the social and political foundations of their society. Thus, they grew more hopeful, more confident, and the rebellions gained steam. By the middle of the 1400s, wars were erupting between peasants and lords across Western Europe. Now, they were not interested in tweaking the system a little bit. They wanted a full-on revolution and to put an end to the power of the lords. So what was the outcome of this revolution? This movement was ultimately successful. The commoners became free farmers with access to commons. This included pastures for grazing, forests for game and timber, waterways for fishing and irrigation. Let's pause our story. Commons. Now, the term commons refers to resources that are accessible to all members of a community and are not privately owned. These resources are typically natural or cultural assets that people can use collectively. So medieval commons refers to the shared lands where community members could, like we said before, graze their livestock, collect firewood, fish, and harvest resources like herbs or berries, as an example. These areas were essential to the communal life and economy, allowing for a collective management of natural resources. Rights to use the commons were typically tied to local customs and laws, ensuring that all villagers had access to the resources they needed to live. So commoners won the rights to have access to these commons, so common land, common food, common resources, etc. In addition, they also saw their working life improved. So for the first time, they were able to bargain for shorter working hours, take weekends off, worked for extra wages if they wanted the income but could choose not to. In Germany, peasants came to control up to 90% of the land. Wages rose to levels higher before than ever in recorded history. Rents declined, food became cheap, and nutrition improved. So as feudalism fell apart, the peasants began to build a clear alternative, an egalitarian and cooperative society which is built on the foundations of local self-sufficiency. And this is a huge change in living conditions for commoners. Additionally, it was also a golden age for Europe's ecology. The feudal system had been a bit of an ecological disaster. It was driving deforestation, overgrazing, and a gradual decline in soil fertility, but these trends started to reverse. Once commoners won direct access to the land, they were able to have a more two-way and symbiotic relationship with the environment, and the environment benefited from it. They were able to manage the pastures and land through democratic assemblies, with careful rules that regulated grazing, forest use, and tillage. So they had built this cooperative and self-sufficiency, egalitarian society. Were Europe's elites happy with this? Unsurprisingly, they were not. They were not happy about the high wages, and they felt irritated that the commoners had the power to only work up until they had enough income to satisfy their needs. How dare they? During the revolutionary period from 1350 to 1500, elites suffered what historians have described as a time of chronic disaccumulation. Now it became increasingly difficult for them to pile up the riches at the same rate that they could under the previous system, feudalism. Jason points out here that the history books can make an assumption that capitalism occurred naturally after the collapse of feudalism. But this was probably impossible because the new egalitarian society, which had foundations such as high wages and self-sufficiency, did not allow for the elite accumulation and the constant accumulation that capitalism requires. Unfortunately and sadly, we will never know what this new society would have grown up to become because it was brutally destroyed. The church and the elites united to end peasant autonomy and reduce wages. Now, how did they do this? They did this in a way by forcing them off their lands in a violent campaign of evictions. What happened to those commons? The pastures, the forests, the rivers that sustained these communities? Well, they were privatized for elite use, also known as property. This whole process was called enclosure, and the destruction was pretty horrifying. Thousands of rural communities were destroyed. There were whole villages that were razed to the ground. these commoners lost access to land, forests, game, water, and fish, all of the resources basically needed to live, right? And these communities did not go down without a fight, but they had little success. The history of these rebellions is bloody and graphic, and I'm going to spare us the details here. Now, over the next 3 centuries, massive areas of Britain and the rest of Europe were enclosed. Millions of people were removed from the land, and this caused a humanitarian crisis. For the first time, commoners were denied access to the most basic resources, and they were left without homes and food, so they had nothing. In England, the word poverty became a popular word. Paupers and vagabonds to describe the refugees. These were the first time that these words ever appeared in English texts. For Europe's capitalists, now this was a dream come true, right? This system enabled them to seize huge amounts of land and resources. Economics recognizes that some initial accumulation was actually needed for the rise of capitalism, with some even suggesting that it happens because a few people worked really hard and saved their earnings. But this is a lie. This was a plunder of resources and a destruction of a collective good. Karl Marx called it a primitive accumulation, and I think that really highlights the barbaric nature of this process. Coincidentally, one of the most crucial features of capitalism was also solved with enclosures, and that is lots and lots of cheap labor. With the commons destroyed and the economies razed to the ground, now the common man or woman had no choice but to sell their labor for wages. And this wasn't for a little bit of extra income like before, but simply in order to survive. For the first time in world history, they became something known as proletarians. Now, this refers to the social class of wage earners and the members of society whose only possession of significant economic value is their labor power. While they were not slaves, they technically didn't have a choice: work or starve. Does that sound familiar? The conventional narrative about capitalism is misleading at times. It wasn't this gradual and natural evolution, but it emerged through organized violence, mass impoverishment, and the systematic destruction of these self-sufficient economies. Capitalism thrived by gaining control of production means, making peasants and workers reliant on it for survival. And this is not even that different from feudalism. It's almost an extreme version of feudalism's principles. So it wasn't like when the commoners created this new society, like the feudalism principles and ideologies just went away. They were still there and they became more extreme. The transition into this new capitalist society from 1500s to the 1800s and into the Industrial Revolution was marked by widespread rebellion and was one of the bloodiest and most turbulent periods in history. For human welfare, the consequences of enclosure were devastating. The social fabric was left so broken that between 1600 and 1650, populations in Western Europe actually declined. In Britain, enclosure went further than anywhere in Europe. When the elites assumed control of the parliament, following the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution in the 1600s, they did whatever they wanted. They introduced a new set of laws, the parliamentary enclosures. And this was a big moment because this was a law. This was something set in stone with writing to it. And this basically sanctioned enclosures. The ramifications of this were pretty intense and immense. Between 1760 and 1870, around 7 million acres were enclosed, and this was about 1/6 of England. By the end of the period, there was almost no common land left in the country. The Industrial Revolution is the final dark episode in the destruction of the English peasant. These dispossessed, sick, hungry, poor people poured into the cities, where they provided the cheap labor that fueled the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. Dark satanic mills was an interesting comparison or analogy that was described by William Blake, who was an English poet and painter during that time. The rise of industrial capitalism came at a huge human cost. It's been estimated that there was a drastic decline in life expectancy during the first century of the Industrial Revolution. Levels plummeted to those not seen since the Black Death in the 14th century. Life expectancy in industrial hubs like Manchester and Liverpool dramatically dropped compared to non-industrial areas, reaching as low as 25 years old in Manchester. 25 years old, that is so young. But this trend was not only England, it manifested in every European country that was studied. These initial centuries of capitalism ushered in unprecedented misery compared to the era before it. So today, we covered the history of what happened in Western Europe within their own borders. Were they content with just accumulating wealth generated by their own lands? Of course not. The same primitive accumulation process was happening across the global south through a process known as colonialism. All right, that ends our story for today. I hope that wasn't too depressing. I'm not going to speak too much about what we just discussed because next episode will flow on and there was a lot to take in there. I think the main things is that capitalism was born in a way that I think is quite unexpected and shocking and surprising. This story only covered Western Europe, but a lot of the world has capitalist structures in place, and the next part of our story will talk about how capitalism and those ideologies got shipped overseas through colonization of other lands. Before we conclude today, I'd like to invite you to another reflection with me. Now, we talked about the struggle between the commons and the process of enclosures. Do we think that they still go on today? And if they do, they probably look a little bit different than they did in previous centuries. Just a reminder, so an enclosure refers to the process by which common land or resources is turned into a private property. This process restricts the use of these resources to the owners and prevents the general public or local communities from using it. And a commons is a term that is used to describe a common resource or good or a natural resource or a space that is accessible to all members of a community. So I was thinking about this and I was like, okay, there must be commons that are still around today because the concept of commons doesn't leave us, right? And I think it's so important to have common spaces, common resources, things like the air. All of us should have a right to speak about the air which we breathe and to have a say in the decisions being made. So that got me thinking and started doing some research, and I came up with 3 commons that I think are relevant today. And what I'm going to ask for, and if you're down and if you want to think about ways that these commons are enclosed. So the first common that I thought of is digital commons. So digital commons really encompasses the vast array of information, data, and knowledge that is freely accessible over the internet. And this helps foster an environment of shared learning and innovation. Then I started thinking about a way that this has been enclosed. And I really thought about social media companies and how they mine user data. So this practice turns the freely shared information of individuals into proprietary data used for profit, effectively enclosing what was once a shared digital space in this regard. So I don't know if there's a process where you can go to Facebook and ask them to give all of your user data back, right? Like, I don't think that's a thing. Once it's out there, it's theirs to claim and to use it against you in forms of advertising or selling it off, right? Another common that I thought of is environmental commons. These are natural resources like air, water, forests, and wildlife that are considered common goods for all to share. A way that this is being enclosed, I really thought again of carbon trading schemes that basically turn carbon sequestration into a privately owned commodity that companies and governments can trade. But individuals that breathe the air and suffer the consequences of carbon in the air don't have a say in it. So it's almost become privatized in a way. And the last one that I thought of was intellectual commons, similar to digital. So yeah, these are two that I thought of. What are some more that you may think of? Please let me know. Let me know on Instagram or comment on the episode through the website. I'd love to know. And what are some ways that you think that our digital commons and environmental commons are being enclosed today? So just to recap on this episode, we discussed and explored the origins of capitalism and its consequences on the common folk in Western Europe. If we think about the concept of the modern maze, this episode discussed how we began in the maze, especially within the capitalist economic space. And it was not by accident or as a natural progression of human society. Rather, it was a violent and forceful seizing of capital by the elites at the expense of the commoners. This is the foundation of capitalism, and its deep-rooted ideologies such as never-ending accumulation and privatization of common resources became staples in its structures that still lives on to this day. Now, just to point out, again, that this is a critique of an economic system that is typically used in the free world. There are other systems out there in dictatorships and communist countries that have their own, set of challenges. So this is just specifically a critique on capitalism. I would highly encourage you to read more from this book if you're interested. And on our next episode, we're going to continue referencing this book and we're going to continue the next chapter of the rise of capitalism. I'm also going to introduce the notion of the paradox of artificial scarcity. Now, this refers to the situation where scarcity is artificially created through social constructs or deliberate actions, despite there being an abundance of resources. Last thing again, I would just like to remind you, if you would like a summary of this episode with all of the key insights and highlights, then please check out The Modern Maze, just one word, lower caps on Instagram, where I provide a summary of each episode and also post all of the new things coming and where I try and poll people and get a gauge of what people are looking for. And please leave me comments and questions and send me DMs. And please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or anything else at all. That is all for today. Thank you so much for joining me. It means the world to me. I look forward to the next time we chat. Please look after yourselves. Take care, and I will speak to you soon. Namaste.